I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Rhea George. I'm the Managing Director of AIA Virginia, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to our panel discussion today about the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at the University of Virginia. Before introducing our first speaker, I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank Maggie Thacker for suggesting this conversation and helping to convene it. So thank you very much, Maggie. And a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. And now I am very pleased to introduce Alice Rauscher, AIA. She is the architect for University of Virginia, and she oversees the selection process for all of the capital projects and has been a great advocate for design excellence, accessibility, resilience, equity, and sustainability. So now I'm going to turn things over to Alice, who's going to kick off our discussion. Alice, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rhea, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce my colleagues, I'd like to express my thanks to AIA Virginia, of which I'm a proud member and who is our host for this webinar. I have the good fortune to work with extraordinary professionals in the Office of the Architect, especially Mary Hughes, who has served as our University Landscape Architect since 1996. Her responsibilities include oversight of contemporary landscape design and cultural landscape preservation for the main campus in Charlottesville, as well as remote field stations. Mary serves as co-director of the Historic Landscape Institute, an adult education program featuring the Jefferson landscapes of Central Virginia as laboratories for applying historical, horticulture, and preservation practices. Prior to assuming her current position at UVA, she worked for the National Park Service. She is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and was awarded the Lagasse Medal by ASLA in 2012 for contributions in the conservation and stewardship of public lands. Meejin Yoon is an architect, designer, and educator. She is currently the Gail and Ira Drucker Dean of Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. Previously, she was professor and head of the Department of Architecture at MIT, where she began teaching in 2001. Yoon is the co-founding principal of Howeler Yoon Architecture, a multidisciplinary architecture and design studio that has garnered international recognition for a wide range of built work. Her design work and research investigate the intersections between architecture, technology, and public space. Yoon received the New Generation Design Leadership Award by Architectural Record in 2015, the U.S. Artist Award in Architecture and Design in 2008, and the Rome Prize in Design in 2005. She is the co-author of Public Works, Unsolicited Small Projects for the Big Dig in 2009, and Absence in 2003. Mabel O. Wilson is a professor of architecture and of African American and African diaspora studies at Columbia University. She serves as the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. Wilson has authored Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture from 2017, Negro Building, African Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums from 2012, and the volume Race and Modern Architecture from the Enlightenment to Today in 2020 with Irene Chang and Charles Davis. With her practice, Studio And, she is a collaborator in the architectural team that has recently completed the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at the University of Virginia. Thank you all for participating today. So UVA has always been and remains distinctive from the initial conception of the academical village and its relationship to its academic mission, or the secular nature of the university itself and its overriding founding purpose, to educate citizen leaders for our then new democracy. But while the history of the institution Thomas Jefferson founded in 1817 can be found in many volumes, until recently the history of just how the university was constructed and how it functioned in its early years was kept virtually hidden. In recent years, we've begun to reckon with our full history, both physical and social. Enslaved people built many of our structures, and white supremacy is still embedded into many of our systems. As you can even see from this highway marker on University Avenue, just in front of the rotunda, a standard history is stated with no mention of the enslaved. So Mary Hughes will take us through a brief history of how we began this journey to the memorial. Mary?
Thank you, Alice. Good afternoon, everyone. The first official recognition of this hidden history was in the form of an apology issued by the Board of Visitors in 2007. At the same time, they authorized installation of a plaque in the floor of the walkway in front of the rotunda, co-equal with the recognition that they gave to white craftsmen and builders who worked on the university. This plaque had the unintended consequence of sparking student outrage. Students felt that this was not a sufficient honor, not sufficient recognition for the role that, that the enslaved had played in the early university and the long years in which that history had been hidden from view. And so this outrage ended up really forming the base momentum for creating a proper memorial. The students formed an organization that was recognized by Student Council as the Memorial for Enslaved Laborers. And this group then sponsored a design competition in 2011 to raise awareness and interest in building a memorial. In 2012, if we go to the next slide, this hidden history became even more tangible to the university community when archaeologists discovered 70 unmarked graves behind the university's official cemetery, thought to be the graves of the servants that were referenced in reminiscences by a lawn resident in the late 19th century. In that same year, then, President Sullivan created the President's Commission on Slavery at the university with a charge to provide her with recommendations regarding the recognition and acknowledgement of the history of slavery at the University of Virginia. In the subsequent years of its 5-year lifespan, the PCSU undertook many, many actions, including the creation of a walking tour of sites related to enslavement. This tour, by the way, is now available online on the university's website, sponsored by the library. So it's on our official website. In 2016, the PCSU sponsored a symposium on the topic of memorialization that was very well attended by university leaders. The panel, you can see here, President Sullivan herself attended that, that session. The room was packed, and the panel included, among others, a member of the Board of Visitors, the chair of the Building and Grounds Committee, who made a very visible leadership presence and expressed public support for the construction of a memorial. I'll turn this back to Alice for subsequent steps.
Thanks, Mary. So after this MLK symposium that in 2016 that Mary just referenced, we had a groundswell of support to put forth a project for approval to begin planning a memorial. So once it was approved as a project, we were able to post RFQs and RFPs to engage a consultant. We shortlisted 5 firms for proposals and interviews from the numerous submissions we received, and the team led by Howeler Yoon was the selection committee's highest ranked firm. The team's process for engaging the Boston and MIT communities for the development of the Collier Memorial at MIT had as much influence on the selection committee as the quality of the design itself and the meaningful fabrication process of the structure. So on this slide, you see a detailed drawing of the component pieces of the Collier Memorial, the attention to detail during fabrication, and an image of the finished memorial on the right. The Memorial to Enslaved Laborers design team, pictured here, led by Meejin and Eric Höweler, was very thoughtfully composed and included UVA's own Frank Dukes, Mabel Wilson, Gregg Bleam, and Eto Otitigbe. But there are also many, many others who helped bring this extraordinary project to fruition. And some of the key members of the larger team are listed here, and many of whom I hope are listening to this webinar. We owe you our sincerest thanks for your encouragement, participation, and support of this process. And now I'd like to introduce Mabel Wilson and Meejin to discuss the project's concept and design.
Next, please. So when the university opened in 1826, UVA's 10 pavilions housed faculty and family, rooms that boarded 125 white male students, and the verdant swath of the terrace lawn was crowned by the rotunda, the centerpiece of the ensemble that housed the library. In his plans for what he called an academical village, Thomas Jefferson brought together an exclusive community in an environment he designed to be conducive to, as he wrote, to health, to study, to manners, morals, and order. Could I have the next slide, please? And so here you see on, this is a cartouche from a very famous map. So what, until recently remained silent in official historical narratives about the university's antebellum period from 1817 to 1865 was the mention of the academical village's dependency on an equal number of enslaved men, women, and children who built, worked, and lived at the university. That history, as we see here, hid in plain sight for 155 years. Next, please. So along with clearing, and terracing the area known as the lawn, or felling trees and milling them into planks, but we can include the daily activities of bringing wood to the rooms and the caretaking of children like we just saw, it was mostly enslaved workers, many young boys who did the back-breaking labor of digging the clay, filling the molds, and firing the bricks for the estimated 1.2 million bricks for the rotunda. The fingerprints on the bricks, like these seen in Monticello, have stories to tell. And our challenge was to make materials speak. And so Meejin will follow.
So as Mabel has shown, while the architecture of Jefferson is associated with the ideals of democracy, it was literally built on the foundations of enslavement. And the traces of that enslavement are legible in the material of its architecture and landscape. How then to design an appropriate expression to this history to commemorate the lives of the enslaved was the design challenge. And the question of whose history, whose stories, whose voices was very critical. The memorial had to engage both the institutional history of the university as well as the public history of the community. And it became clear that in order to design such a project, we first had to start by designing the process, one that would engage the multiple voices, the multiple stories, and the many communities that the memorial was for. So over the course of about 4 to 6 months, we engaged multiple stakeholders really on their turf, going from classrooms with students and alumni to local community members at the Jefferson School or local churches, or offsite to the descendant community. And we also work with an incredible group of community ambassadors that reached out to even smaller groups and to individuals. And it became clear through that engagement process that for the memorial to have both meaning and relevance to the multiple publics, it had to honor, of course, the enslaved, but it also had to advance the commemorative landscape for racial justice today. Next. The other critical thing to creating a design process that foregrounded dialogue and openness was to bring the public into the early stages of pre-design and concept design. This project was unusual in that there was no single site, no scale, or no budget at the very beginning of the process. And so we began with 3 possible sites ranging from the lawn and the sites in front of pavilions 9 and 10 to the anatomical theater to the triangle of grass. And for each site, because we were testing multiple designs in sketch form, we were able to engage the various communities in a conversation that they were able to have in response to design, but not necessarily focus on the design, but really about their aspirations. And through this process of elimination and iteration, we heard from the communities what they wanted. Next. And what we heard was that the memorial had to be more of a space than an object, a place for people to come together to learn and reflect. And the memorial needed to express dualities, both pain and suffering, but also resilience and dignity and humanity of those who were enslaved. And that it also needed to be an ongoing memorial to acknowledge that the work of this public history and commemorative landscape was incomplete. Next.
So along with collecting aspirations, hearing about desired meanings, experiences, and the stories that needed to be told by the memorial, as part of our design process, we also researched Black traditions and spaces of gathering, associated cultural forms and rituals that could be translated into our design. So we explored how, for example, people gather to form a ring shout, what you see on the left, a low country ecstatic dance with influences from West Africa, where people move in a circle. We looked at hush harbors, which taught us about how enslaved communities gathered in the forest, whose clearings were mobilized for convenings of religious rituals, ceremonies of burial, and the plotting of insurrections and escapes. And as we see on the right, water became a means to tell the story of liberation through West African libation rituals that honor the spirits of the ancestors, and the currents of rivers that carried people along a route to freedom. Next, please. The students of MEL asked us to consider a memorial design that could be a place for students to meet for activism as well as for education. So the memorial is sited in the triangle of grass on the thresholds between the grounds in the city in order to be accessible to the wider Charlottesville community. It was designed to be a host of commemorative events, such as the yearly Freedom and Liberation Day walk on March 3rd that remembers the day Union troops liberated 14,000 enslaved persons from Albemarle. So you could see the first march on the bottom, and at the top it begins, for example, at the slave auction block. So seeing the memorial as part of a larger commemorative landscape. Next, please. So the memorial is really designed as a meeting ground, a place for commemoration, a site of education, and a place for action. I'll return it to Meejin.
So here you can see the community members marking the location of the memorial with this simple gesture of gathering together in a circle. And the form became that simple, resonant with the ring shout as a gathering of people coming together, and resonant with the message of let freedom ring. Next. As Mabel shared, the memorial sited in the triangle of grass, which is that threshold between the city and the university, and as part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the memorial sits tangent along an important diagonal path between the University Avenue and the Academical Village. And you can see very faintly in a new tangent path that it makes to express the northern escape to the north. Next. And thus, even though the ring is simple in form, the nested rings created by the intersection of two cones creates a layered and varied spatial and tectonic experience. From the lower ring, which holds the historical timeline, to the smooth concave surface of the ring, which holds the memory marks and it inscribes the names of the enslaved laborers, and to the roughened convex exterior surface. And here you can see the various references coming together. Next. The memorial has a prominent presence in the landscape, and so even though it's in dialogue with the rotunda as a ring in form, because it's nestled into the landscape, whereas the rotunda is a closed sphere. The memorial is a kind of open air ring, which is made of a stone ridge line that ascends quite quickly but smoothly. And as you enter into it and the memorial invites you in from the tangent path, you lose the horizon line of the extended landscape and have a kind of intimate relationship with the memorial interior wall. Next. And this kind of combined sense of intimacy and openness was really calibrated through the section of the memorial. And here you can see the section drawing and a mock-up on site. And it's calibrated to inscribe the kind of human body into the memorial itself. So the timeline occupies a scale similar to the scale of a bench, and the concave interior wall slopes outward and leans back, which makes you extend your arms and reach out in order to touch the surface. And the convex surface on the exterior mediates a change in the section or the ground plane, which allows you to see into the memorial openly from higher ground. And the memorial's carved from a local granite called Virginia Mist, which is quarried less than an hour from the site. It's a beautiful gray granite, which when sandblasted or milled appears a very cool gray, but when honed and polished becomes a very dark reflective black. And the range of this type of granite under different finishes was really important to achieve the expressive qualities in material for the memorial. Next, Mabel.
So we work closely with a group of exceptional historians, many of who sat on the President's Commission to study slavery and the university. And their thoughtful examination of UVA's enslaved community and the history of slavery at the university have yielded important publications, such as this collection of essays, Educated in Tyranny, co-edited by Lewis Nelson and Maury McGinnis. Next, please. So to name names, to tell their story required that we engage with an archive of work ledgers as seen here and personal letters of slave owners. And as such, it is an archive laced with silences as well as with violence. Next, please. So we estimated that somewhere around 4,000 enslaved men, women, and children built, worked, and lived at UVA from 1817 to 1865. Now, of that number, 3,111 of them were what we, as the design team, kept referring to as the unknown unknowns, those with no first or last name. We had records for 889 persons, and we mostly know the first names of 577 people. So the 311 remaining recorded people, we assigned kinship, relationships, and occupations. Next, please. So the result of this research and the experimentation and material, in conversation with our descendant community and our historians, was to design a kind of genealogical cloud of this community that stretches across the inner surface and inscribes these names, these memories on the surface of the memorial. Next, please. So in this detail, you can see that we worked to reimagine social relations and to rehumanize the experiences of the enslaved. So we engage them, Henry, Isabella, John, as individuals. We see families of sisters and grandmothers. We see bell ringers, woodcutters, laundresses. And we see a community recalled through the 4,000 memory marks that speak back, sometimes with tears, to their descendants and to us. And so you can see in this detail the tactility of the granite that draws us into this history. If new names are discovered, they can be added through a new commemorative ritual. Next, please. So here you see the sort of rough outer surface. We see the names remembering the enslaved, but also we see visitors who are examining the timeline and the water that captures the attention so that people will learn this history, this excavated history of the university. Next, please. So the timeline is composed of 70 entries that begin with the arrival of the enslaved to Virginia in 1619. And you can see that list of the entries to the right. But it also recounts the arrival of Jefferson to the site of UVA with enslaved workers in tow. We read about the kinds of work done at the university, along with the efforts of the enslaved to run away, and also the difficult histories of violent attacks and assaults. We end the timeline with a poignant quote from Isabella Gibbons that you can see on the left, who remembers the horrible cruelties, as she said, committed against her, her family, and her community. I will return to Meejin.
Thanks. Next. So I think here you can see the timeline, both without the water and then the water as a kind of cleansing and libation ritual. Next. And to both kind of complement and contrast the memory marks on the inner concave wall and the libation timeline, the exterior surface had a very different kind of expressive role for the memorial. The goal of the exterior surface was one that layered a kind of material culture of the time. So these kind of rough stones that you would find in the cemeteries, the unmarked, the unnamed tombstones, as well as the representational aspects that were desired from the community. So next. So as we looked as a design team in terms of techniques to roughen the stone, this is Eto Otitigbe and Eric Höweler trying to bush hammer the very inert granite to roughen that texture. Next. And what we ultimately decided was to create these larger scaled shallow depressions in the exterior surface to kind of roughen it and for it to catch light and shadow in different ways. Next. And one of the things we heard from the community was a desire and a need for a representation of figural or literal as part of the memorial. And we felt it was important to work with an artist who could tie both history to contemporary practice. And we reached out to the artist Eto Otitigbe. He's Nigerian born and American, who did this incredible series called Becoming Visible, which is his own self-portrait in a hoodie that was completed after the killing of Trayvon Martin. And it inspired us to really rethink and reimagine what a portraiture could mean for the memorial. Next. So the protagonist for the memorial became Isabella Gibbons. She was, as Mabel already referred to, an enslaved woman. She was owned by Professor William Barton Rogers. And despite Virginia law prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read and write, Isabella was taught to read and write, and in turn taught her children as well. And post-emancipation, Isabella and her family remained in Charlottesville, and she became a teacher, teaching at the Charlottesville Freedman School until her death. And her representation is one of the few photographic records we have of an enslaved person from this period. Next. So the work Eto created carves the eyes of Isabella Gibbons into the stone at a colossal scale, using a technique of carving that translates a raster photographic image into a series of carved lines that are made by a V-shape milling tool. And because it cuts at varying depths and widths, the way the light hits it, it simulates very much the photographic image. And it becomes very visible in certain angles and in certain light. And we liked very much that the eyes of Isabella would be in the process of becoming visible to those who were looking for her. And she looks back as well. Next. So we did this precisely with robotic CNC machine equipment to get the kind of precision right. Next. And we did a series of tests that we laid out to get a sense of the scale and the legibility of the eyes. And then next. And here you can see from a distance the eyes of Isabella Gibbons, who has become a watcher and a witness for the memorial. And Mabel referred to the last entry in the timeline, which is Isabella Gibbons' passing. And it ends with a quote she published in the Freedmen's Record in 1867. Can we forget the crack of the whip, the cowhide, the whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten the horrible cruelties hundreds of our race killed? No, we have not, nor ever will. So as we finished the memorial, we thought it was about acknowledging this history, but realized through the process and increasingly towards the end that it was also about rebuilding trust at a local scale between the institution and its communities, plural. And if we zoom out today at the national scale on conversations on race and reconciliation, could the memorial serve as a model to begin to rebuild trust between communities at a larger scale? Next, I'm handing it over to Mary.
So after the long process of advocating for designing and building the memorial, the construction fence came down just as COVID-19 began to have an impact on our community. And the university shut its doors to in-person classes. And so the impact of the memorial is just, we're in its infancy really in terms of our understanding of it. We certainly are seeing people drawn to it and using it, which is wonderful. Even during construction, UVA had hired a genealogist, Dr. Shelley Murphy, to trace the descendants of the enslaved whose names had been discovered by the historians and inscribed upon the wall of the memorial. Pictured here, we have two of them, Detisa Gathers and Colleen Yates, who are local activists and leaders in the descendant community. They are also key members of a committee that was formed during construction, a committee called the Community Engagement Committee, to bind UVA staff and faculty with community members in continuing the engagement that had begun so wonderfully during the design process, so that during construction, people in the community would be informed about the progress on the memorial, and the memorial could actually be used to spark important conversations. It was during this time a focus for discussing difficult topics, such as the history of slavery at UVA, as well as issues of racial relations and injustice in the Charlottesville-Albemarle community, engaging with local educators and students. I think we had probably over 300 individuals who came to the site during construction for one of these sessions, both in a classroom and touring the construction site during that time, which was a really great introduction. People were very moved, even when it was barely out of the ground. Next, in 2019, the Black Alumni Reunion had a special session celebrating the emerging memorial, a panel discussion discussing the design, as well as a tour of the construction site. It was just a terrible day, pouring down rain. The site was awfully muddy. You could barely walk around, but people were so visibly moved by the sight of the memorial becoming real. They were drawn to touch the names on the stone mock-up panels. And this really is a foreshadowing of the reaction that we see time and time again when people come to the memorial. They are drawn to that wall and to touching those memory marks and the names. On March 3rd, 2020, the memorial, while still under construction, was included in the ritual celebration of Freedom and Liberation Day, just as we had hoped. Was visited by 80 community members on the march from the university to downtown Charlottesville, as we had always hoped that it would be. And Alice, I will turn to you for the finale.
Thanks, Mary. And recently, the memorial was used by UVA medical faculty and staff for a very moving White Coats for Black Lives moment of silence and reflection following the death of George Floyd. And even though, given our COVID concerns, as Mary mentioned, the official dedication of the memorial has been postponed, as you can see, the impact it is having is really everything we could have hoped for. With that, thank you very much for listening, and we will open this up for questions.
Well, thank you all so very much for sharing your experiences and your insights in the process. I have a couple of questions from the audience. The first was sort of expressing disappointment that the dedication had to be postponed, and was wondering about the plans to reschedule it in the coming year or next year, or is there a vision for a celebration moving forward?
I think I can speak to that. The plan at this point is to postpone the dedication to next April of 2021, where it will very happily coincide with the biannual Black Alumni Reunion. So that will be, it was felt that was hopefully going to be a safe time to plan a large gathering again, and it also had that happy coincidence with the Black alumni group being in Charlottesville at that time.
Great, thank you. When's the water going to begin flowing?
Mary, you want to take that as well?
Well, we are in the final stages of tweaking the water feature. We have to make some adjustments to the water level, and that has required some additional design, which was not very easy to do, given that our consultants were not able to travel, and our water feature designer is in Canada and still not able to even come over the border. So that is taking longer than we would have hoped, but we are working on it.
Great, thank you.
Rhea, can I take a moment? I saw in the chat that I wanted to give a real call out to Mike Spence, who was a superintendent extraordinaire and an incredible ambassador for the project during construction, working for Team Henry. It's, as I mentioned and showed in that slide, it was impossible to thank just everybody who's just given, their life, their life to this project. But certainly Mike was amazing during the project, and showing up on weekends to give tours, going above and beyond. So thank you, Mike.
Great, thank you. So an audience members asked that, they noted they don't often hear the term enslaved laborers. So could you all speak to the motivation or meaning behind the use of that term?
Mabel, can you?
I mean, I will say maybe two things. One, it's the term that the students used. So they formed their group called For the Memorial for Enslaved Laborers. So that was a term that they chose, and we've honored basically their contribution to the project by keeping that as the name for the memorial. But also the term enslaved person or enslaved laborer really sort of points to slavery more as a social relation, as something that is done to someone, as instead of the term slave, which is just, just says, turns a person into a thing. So enslaved implies that someone has to be made into that condition.
Great, thank you. Can one of you share a little bit about the significance of the paving stones in the grass?
Sure, I can share a little bit about that, and Mabel, feel free to jump in there. We wanted to mark the passage, the Northern Escape, and to have a kind of subtle northern mark in the landscape. And I think it helps to also reorient the memorial, so it's not about the existing primary axes and circulation, but creates new ones to the site as well.
And we oriented northward, as the direction of escape. So north being the path to freedom.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the fundraising process? How was the money raised for the memorial, and was it raised from donations, or did the university find the funds?
Well, I think it was a little bit of both, a lot of bit of both. It's both there's not one particular donor. It was a real groundswell of support financially as well as, for the project, but the university did take the major expense as its role.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little about the process for adding additional names to the memorial as they are discovered?
Yes, we definitely planned for the addition of names to the memorial. Those memory marks do provide a great platform for adding the names in the future. We will have to figure out a process, for vetting the names, like the historians that Mabel described, the very rigorous process of combing the records to find the names of the enslaved and to figure out which were duplicates and what was the right spelling and so forth and so on. So that process will have to continue in the future under someone's jurisdiction. So but that definitely is has been thought of.
Great, thank you. So someone in the chat asks, were there any objections during the design and community meetings? And if so, how did the team deal with those objections or incorporate them into the conversation around design?
I mean, Mabel and I can both speak to this. I don't recall, or maybe I can't even hear something anymore as an objection. I think we heard lots of opinions, but overwhelming support increasingly as the conversation and dialogue and the kind of earnest efforts of the design team and university were made really very evident to the communities. And, you know, it was really about scale and site, and people had different opinions about which sites might be more suitable than others. But I feel towards the, you know, by the middle of the community engagement process, there was a lot of consensus. Mabel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, you know, everything that we heard was really useful, supportive. You know, it really just gave us a kind of range of things that we could be in dialogue with to sort of feel out what might be the most appropriate and also the most kind of engaging on multiple levels in terms of like how we chose. So it was a really remarkable process. I mean, it was really a conversation and a dialogue that was extraordinarily helpful. But I also think, you know, along the way, you know, we designed a process, but as a design team, it was really remarkable because we kind of came into a community in formation. And as we finish, you know, the memorial finishes up, there is now this community that sort of claims it and claims stewardship over it. And the process, I think, for inscribing the names will now engage that community. And I think that's a really remarkable outcome.
I'd also like to add that there was no preconceived notion, you know, walking into this. So I think that the fact that it began with dialogue and began with you know, just doing a lot of listening, I think went a long way. And the fact that for the 4 sites that were proposed, I think the team came up with 2 different options, 2 different concepts for each. So, you know, now there's a discussion around 8, if I've got that math right, Meejin. I think there's now a discussion around 8 concepts, which, you know, was extraordinarily rich, right? There was not an idea about this is what it's going to be. It was the discussion of attributes of each. And I would say that for the administration, the university's administration, that was very helpful as well, that at every turn we were transparent, you know, that there was a discussion early on about the site selection, about the concepts, so that everybody felt invested. And that went a long way, I think, to its approval.
I think the other thing that I would observe was pretty remarkable about that process was that at each one of those public meetings, it seems like there was a preferred site, and that changed over the weeks of dialogue. So, you know, we ended up landing on the Triangle of Grass site, which actually was the site where the student competition, you know, what was located. And, but there were many moments when there were preferred sites at the south end of the lawn and other places. So it was a real rich dialogue that led us to the site as well as the design.
Great, thank you. So there has been some conversation in the chat and some questions submitted about the photographs that were on the fence, and folks are very curious about what the future of those photographs are. Can you share a little bit about that?
The Holsinger photos, Mary, those were reproductions of photos that are in our special collections. And, you know, we try to make even construction sites be, you know, learning experiences. So even when we were renovating the rotunda, there were enlarged photographs of not only the history, but the process of doing some construction. So the Holsinger photographs was a quite remarkable precursor to what the experience of a memorial will be. And I think, Mary, you can share the experience. I think it's Datisa, correct? We
Yes.
saw her ancestor in one of the photographs. It was quite moving.
Right, and she was able to talk to the students that we toured through the site about the lineage of, you know, that photograph represents with her great-grandmother. So those, I'm glad somebody asked. I mean, it was impossible to put everything into our talk, but those photographs on the construction fence were one of the most riveting construction fences I think I've ever seen. I mean, people, even when they couldn't see the memorial or couldn't be inside the fence, they really took time looking at those photographs, which of course the ones that were blown up on the construction fence are not archival quality and aren't a permanent exhibition, but the photographs themselves certainly are.
Great. Thank you. So there have been a couple of questions about lighting. Is the lighting that's currently in place temporary, or is it part of an overall design scheme?
Who wants to answer that?
The answer is a little bit of both at the moment, but that's kind of, anyway, Meejin, why don't you take that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think the lighting was designed as part of a larger landscape strategy. And so originally there was the idea that there would be additional trees planted in the vicinity as well. And because of the reception of the memorial by the community, and particularly the descendant community, and hearing their feedback, it was important to keep the memorial very open on that slope site. And so the lighting now both needs to be adjusted in terms of brightness, because I think that still hasn't been set. It still needs to be set to the right light levels. But I think we're gonna adjust the scale of the lights as well. So that part is not fully complete.
And the existing lights were hit by lightning.
Yes.
During
Yeah.
a severe thunderstorm that we experienced here in Charlottesville. What was it, a couple of weeks ago? I believe, Alice, you lost power entirely, and our lights were struck, and they're very tall, so they make quite a target, and all of them literally were destroyed.
So we like to say it was a force of nature, since we were all wringing our hands about the fact that they were so prominent now without the trees surrounding them.
Can you talk a little bit about the memorial's designation as a facility? Is it a protected, safe space? Is there a formal process to host events there?
The Community Engagement Committee will continue post-construction to advise the university on events. I mean, we always wanted it to be a place that would be programmed for, for artistic events and so forth. We are actually working with the General Counsel's office to figure out how best to protect the memorial while still encouraging and allowing events to take place there. So that is still an act in progress.
Hey, Mary, could you elaborate a little bit on the Continuing Community Engagement Committee in which you sit, and and how they're acting with the community?
Yes, so we have community members, faculty members, and educators in the local community who are all working together under the auspices of the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And that committee continues to meet once a month. They are actively now very much planning the dedication ceremony to take place next spring. We've had, a lot of hand-wringing discussions about what is going to be the state of gathering in spring of 2021. So I think the committee is working on plans for both a virtual celebration and dedication, as well as the in-person gathering that we had so much hoped that we would have. Also, the descendant community is planning their own dedication ceremony, which may, because it will likely be, because of travel restrictions, likely be a smaller group, might be able to happen sooner rather than later. And we had promised the descendants that, you know, the act of turning on the water officially would happen when their own private ceremony was able to be held.
Can you talk about the events of August 11th and 12th in 2017? Did it impact the design team and the process?
I think it was somewhat fortuitous for the memorial that we got approval of the design concept by the Board of Visitors in June of 2017. And so the design team was authorized to move forward into construction documents at that time. So the public, all of the public meetings and communication had occurred in 2016 and early 2017, culminating in a accepted design concept that was approved.
But I would say that it was just overlapping events. I would say that, I mean, I don't want to speak for the design team, but it seems that the design was well on its way. It was overlapping events, but incredibly timely given this year's tragedies as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that the events in Charlottesville affected everyone, clearly nationally, and in our return to our conversation and dialogue, it had a different kind of edge to it, or it had a different kind of after the events that happened. But certainly at the beginning of the project, one of the things that we discussed as a team is that we didn't want the memorial to be a site of forgetting, and that we recognized that the aftermath of enslavement, the challenges that come with a legacy of anti-Black racism are still with us, and that the site really had to be a kind of catalyst for that conversation, that ongoing conversation. And that is something that we all felt very committed to as we worked on the project.
Can, I guess that's on the design team, talk a little bit about the wall markings, the memory marks, what they're intended to represent?
And Meejin, please follow up with this. But we were thinking about how do we include everyone? I mean, this was something that we really heard from our community engagement, that it was very important to name names, to really identify, as many people as we could within the enslaved community. And we were like, yes, and then as we started to get into the details, we realized, wow, that's not so easy when you're engaging an archive of slavery, because often the erasure of the name is part and parcel of the violence, right, that is enacted, right, that Isabella Gibbons describes, to keep one in that condition of a non-human. And so we had to start to think about, well, then how do we mark the community? How do we show, everyone that is here? And so the memory mark became a way, even though we don't know the name, right? We knew we couldn't put unknown on the surface, but a way of marking it. And then, that even the mark always has a possibility that the name could be known. And that became, I think, a very poignant way of beginning to mark the surface, and literally as a kind of acting, scraping, gashing the stone, as a sign of the labor.
I will say that the discovery of the retention of water in those memory marks and in the names, and seeing post-rain how they retained the water and then appeared to weep as the surface of the stone dried, was one of the most moving surprises, I think, that we discovered.
Yeah, that was perfectly articulated. I think I don't need to add anything to that description.
So we are coming up on 5 p.m. I have another question from the chat, but then we may wrap up with any closing remarks you might like to make. So there's an inquiry about what role the School of Architecture played maybe in the initial programming or design of the memorial. Can you speak to that?
Mabel, as an alum of the architecture school, the A school, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I mean, one of the engagement events that we had was actually with students in architecture to sort of talk about the memorial and hear their feedback. I'm sure some of the students actually came to our, the community events at the Jefferson School hosted by Andrea Douglas, who did an amazing job. Really just drew in lots of folks. And so the Dean, Isla Berman, was very welcoming and, gave us, any opportunity or platform to sort of share what we were working on with the students.
And Frank, of course, is on the faculty of the A School.
Okay, one more question from the chat. And this is from a government architect in California, and they were curious if this is known to be one of the first public memorials to enslaved people, or if not, it might be a model for others. Or can you speak to that a little bit?
No, this is actually not the first one to enslaved peoples. There are others, and part of our research was to try to find those around the world, and certainly in the US. There was one at Brown. Brown was one of the first universities to sort of engage their history of slavery, and it's a sculpture by Martin Puryear. The artist Doho Sud did a beautiful piece at the University, UNC, I think Chapel Hill. William and Mary has one in process. And so, so this is entering in, but I think what for me is very poignant about this one in particular is that the university still functions as a university. And so this enslaved community is remembered by a community that is still engaged in the same spaces of education. And I think that's very unusual, that a lot of, the way in which people associate slavery is with plantations, and we don't have plantations anymore. So those houses are these kind of historic artifacts. The university is a historic site, but it's also an active university. And I think that makes this a unique learning opportunity for students and also for the broader community.
Thank you, Mabel. I don't remember, and maybe from the panel would like to make any closing remarks as we wrap up?
I would just like to say that, all the way through, this has been both a humbling and invigorating process, and resulting in a memorial that is, really more than we could have hoped for. So I want to thank my fellow panelists for doing this and sharing this incredible work, and welcome everybody once we're over this, COVID period, come to UVA and visit the memorial in person.
Well, wonderful. Mabel, Meejin, Alice, and Mary, I'm so grateful for you joining us and sharing about the process and the community engagement discussions that you had, and highlighting a really beautiful memorial there in place at the university. So thank you all so much. And thank you to all of our attendees for the wonderful questions. We appreciate you joining us, and we will look forward to future discussions. The recording of this session will be made available on aiava.org within a day or so. So if you would like to come back and revisit it, please feel free to do so. Thank you all so much.